I want to make a video about all the nice things that one can do even when they are alone. I see so many of my friends who are bitter about being single, and I actually think that's the most enjoyable part of life. I'm going to start with my childhood. When I was 5 years old, my mom used to have a big fear of driving in bad weather. We lived in a suburb of Pittsburgh. She was working at a department store. It was called Hills. And she would have big fears of driving during the winter time. And my dad would have to give her a ride to the store. And one night, my dad and I went to the store to pick up my mom. I think it was around Christmas time because it was late in the evening. And when we got to Hills, the entire roof of the department store was just covered in snow. And for some reason, that memory sticks out. I mean, it was Christmas time. I was excited about Christmas. You know, I was a kid and I love snow. I hate snow nowadays because, again, it causes problems with driving. I have a Mitsubishi Lancer, so I don't like to be driving in snow. But at the time, it was a fun event, right? Although if I'm staying here during Christmas time and everything's walking distance, it might not bother me so much. You know, I still love snow. I just don't like dealing with having to commute in it and having to go outside when it's snowing. So I was 5 years old at the time. When I was 7 years old, I wrote my very first computer program. I was programming in QBasic at the time. And my inspiration for the computer program was that as a kid, one of my favorite math exercises to do was to add all the numbers from 1 to 100, because I knew what the answer was going to be, 5,050. And I would always try to see if I could get to that number without making a mistake. And it drove my mom crazy because she would be in the middle of something else. We would be in the car and I would be jotting away, and then I would get to the answer and it was not right. I distinctly remember, I think I was 6 years old at the time. One time I was sitting in the car and I finished adding to 100 and I got the wrong answer, and I was so upset that I had about that much paper that I was writing on. I ripped the paper into shreds because I was so upset. And my mom was very upset because when I ripped it, it caused her to get distracted, and she was like, she told me I was going to cause an accident by doing that, and she screamed at me. But it was a fun exercise for me to do. Eventually, my dad taught me how to use the abacus. You know, he grew up in an age before calculators, and he was showing me how to use the abacus, and I practiced it on that too. It drove everybody crazy that I would always be adding from 1 to 100. And finally, I learned how to do this with the computer. And so I'm adding away, and so I eventually wrote a computer program to do this. And when I ran the computer program, the computer said 0, and my heart just sank. Because I thought it was a masterpiece and it's giving me the wrong answers. And then it was time for dinner, so this was before the age of laptops. The computer sat in a room and I went downstairs to dinner, and I was so depressed to the point that my mom was very concerned. She asked me if there was anything wrong. She thought something had happened at school. You know, did I get a bad grade? Did I get bullied by my classmates? You know, because I used to be a target for all sorts of stuff. I didn't want to tell her that I was programming this stuff, because she already thought I was crazy for constantly jotting away how to add 1 to 100. I didn't want her to think I'm even crazier than that. Okay, so after dinner, I go back into the computer room to look carefully at the program, and it turned out I printed out the wrong variable, and when I corrected it, the computer displayed the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, 5,050! And I went to my bedroom to jump up and down my bed, and when I did that, I broke the spring in my mattress, and I screamed, and my mom came to my bedroom to see what was going on, and finally I confessed to her why I was so depressed at dinner time and how I had broken the spring in my mattress. And my mom wasn't too upset about that, actually. I thought for sure she was going to scream again, because she screamed so loudly that time we were in the car and I was jotting away. And so not long after that, I started programming all sorts of crap on the computer. And I didn't realize this, but this was back in the day we had a 286 computer, and I wrote so many programs that I filled out the hard drive. And so when we went to boot up the computer again, there was not enough disk space to boot. And the computer said, it just said disk read error. It wouldn't boot up. all it said on the screen was discrete error. My dad was so upset. We had to reformat the computer, and I lost everything I ever wrote, and I was pretty upset too. So I had some good times with that. And my mom was super upset now, because now instead of talking about just adding 1 to 100, I was thinking about what else I could program. Every time I did something in math class, I would go home and program it on the computer, and it just drove my parents insane. Okay, fast forward, now I'm a teenager. I used to love to play with chemistry and physics experiments at home. And sometimes they were pretty dangerous things too. One of the first things I ever learned was that I learned that you could recharge non-rechargeable batteries to some extent. And I tried it, and it worked. And when I discovered it worked, we used to have a Radio Shack where people would throw their batteries into this recycling bin. And I would go to Radio Shack to collect them and take them home to recharge. I especially love the 9-volt batteries, because the snaps at the end of the 9-volt batteries would connect in series. So I would recharge 9-volt batteries with this contraption that I made, and then I would connect hundreds of them in series, and now I had hundreds of volts. And one of the first things I learned to do, and quite by accident actually, you got to remember this was before the days of YouTube and even Google, so I didn't really research any of this. I discovered if you short out the batteries, you can make arcs, and then you could pull them apart, go zzz. I wish I had made that as a YouTube video a long time ago. Nowadays there's so many of them that it's not really worthwhile to do it. And I don't really have a safe place to do it. We used to have a fireplace. And so I made, I didn't realize what they were called at the time, but they were Jacob ladders. And one day my brother, he was, I think 1 or 2 years old at the time, said there was a spider in his room. So I took my contraption of about 100 9-volt batteries in series to the room with the spider, and I electrocuted the spider, and the spider instantly vaporized. And my brother was scared to death. He was crying, and the whole room had a smell of cremated spider. And my dad was so upset. He took all the chemistry equipment from my room. He was so upset at me playing with stuff like that. I learned how to, I especially love electrolysis experiments for some reason. I learned how to silver plate various things, silver plating in general, and I plated everything in our house silver, or even our car keys, and I would plate any metal object I could find around the house. It drove my mom crazy. I took an aluminum can just like this, and I beat it into some jewelry, and I silver plated it, and she was okay with that. But the other experiments were okay. I also learned how to make this explosive powder using electrolysis. I learned that flash powder contained potassium chlorate, and so I made some. Well, actually, I made sodium chlorate because I didn't have any potassium compounds on hand. I made it with electrolysis of sodium chloride with, I believe, carbon electrodes. I think I took a number of pencils and I burned them to get the graphite out of it, and I used those as electrodes to make sodium chlorate. And then I eventually boiled it out of the solution, and I had a powdered sodium, only a handful or so, and I placed it into a phone book, and I placed the phone book into the fireplace, and I lit the phone book on fire. And at first, it before it got to the sodium chloride, it was just burning like a regular fire, and my heart kind of sank. I thought I did something wrong. Eventually, the fire got to the sodium chlorate, and it exploded. And the whole phone book disappeared, and it felt like there had been an earthquake. You could feel the shockwave coming out of the fireplace. But it took multiple weeks just to make that small amount of sodium chlorate. I wanted to make a much bigger amount. So here's what I did. We had a front porch outside. I took a bucket, a paint bucket, if you will, about that big, and I placed the electrodes into the solution, and I plugged that directly into the 110 volt outlet. And as soon as I plugged it in, the whole thing went crazy. and it was making it was reacting so fast that it didn't, because the way it works is that the chlorine is supposed that is produced is supposed to dissolve in the solution and react with the sodium hydroxide and make sodium chlorate. But it was producing chlorine so fast it was coming out of the bucket, and the whole front porch area had a very choking chlorine smell to it. It was so bad that I couldn't even get close to the outlet to unplug it. And so I went to the basement to turn off the circuit breaker. When I came back, everything was charred. If I remember correctly, the container was on the ground. There was a tablecloth, and the tablecloth had been discolored from all the chlorine that was produced from the electrolysis. That's how much chlorine gas there was. And the whole experiment had been charred. It was a complete write-off. The electrodes, the wiring, and everything. And my dad was asking me, "What are you doing?" And he started running toward the experiment, and then he started coughing his guts out, and he was so upset. I was exhausted from the ordeal, and I went to the sofa to take a nap. And when I got up and I went to my room, everything was gone. My computer, my chemistry books, my chemistry equipment. He forbade me from ever doing anything like that again. And eventually, I moved out of my parents' home to go pursue my PhD. And then I had a number of other funny stories. I never really played with chemistry again because I've always lived in a place without a fireplace, without a front porch where I could do this. Very close quarters. You don't want to be producing chlorine gas anywhere near any of the places I've lived ever since moving out of my parents' home. Well, I actually did produce some at the beginning of the COVID crisis because I couldn't find Clorox. I actually made my own chlorine bleach, which is very similar to what I did at my parents' home. You just have to keep the solution at an ice cold temperature so that it makes sodium hypochlorite. At room temperature, the hypochlorite breaks down into chlorate. So I did more or less the same thing, but not with the 110 volt outlet. Okay, so now I've moved to Rochester, New York to pursue my PhD. My first semester there, I had a very upsetting situation actually. I had just gotten my first credit card, and I learned about how to get credit card rewards. One day, the whole class and I had gone out to dinner to celebrate one of my classmates graduating, and most of my classmates were going to be paying cash. So I thought, wow, if we could put the whole tab on my credit card and I could collect the cash, that would be a lot of rewards. I remember the entire tab was like $400 or something like that. That was more than I would spend in a typical month, if I remember correctly back then. And then I would pay it and then collect all the cash. I was really happy for my classmate graduating, and I wasn't being very careful about everything. And plus, I was when I go to a restaurant, I have to pay attention to ingredients, so my mind was kind of split on that too. And when I got home, I realized I had been shortchanged by quite a bit. If I remember, $70, $80. I wasn't so upset about the money. I was upset that I had moved out of my parents' home, and I thought I had a group of friends that I could trust. And I didn't, and my heart sank. I went home and went into a serious depression. Not over the money, don't get me wrong. I waste more money than that on all sorts of crap. I was more upset about the betrayal. And I never figured out what happened. I kind of wrote it off to, well, some of the people there were drinking. I wasn't. Not everybody was drinking. Some people were very excited. We were talking about all sorts of other stuff, and I kind of just wrote it off, and I told myself to just be a little bit more cautious with other people, and I never had another classmate take advantage of me like that, so that was good. My second year at RIT, I dated a girl that I had met online, and she took advantage of me financially. To give you an idea, I was living in a house with several housemates. Actually, not much different than this house. It was a lot older than this house, but it was comfortable. But I eventually moved out of that house and moved into my office. They gave me my own office for my PhD work, and even then I couldn't make the girl happy. Well, she was taking advantage of me. I wasn't eating very well either. Around the same time, my friends taught me how to fish out of Lake Ontario. I was eating fish that I was catching out of Lake Ontario, and I was eating roadkill. This was during the winter time in Rochester. We have very long winters here. You could kill an animal and eat it like 2 weeks later in Rochester. That's how cold it gets. And living in my office, eating roadkill, and I got very sick. Keep in mind that when I was living in the office, I wasn't sleeping very well either, because I had to be half awake to make sure nobody would catch me living there. At the beginning, especially when I didn't know the routine. Eventually I came to find out what days they would clean, and then I would rearrange my sleep schedule and all that. But even still, it was kind of like sleeping next to a nuclear alarm. And then I wasn't eating very well either. When I broke up with the girl 3 months later, I was scared to death. And I calculated that I didn't want my parents to know that I had blown all this money, and I wanted to recover my finances. And I calculated that I wouldn't be able to date for at least another 3 more months. And I was scared to death. And the following week, after I broke up with this girl, I went to a coin collecting show. I was collecting coins. I had to recover some of the coins I had lost before my parents found out just how much money I had lost to this girl. And I went to the coin show. I had the best time of my life. I didn't have a girl to take to the coin show, but I had the best time of my life. And it was around that time that I realized life as a single guy, that's the best life ever. And so this was at the beginning of summer. And so I gave myself 3 months away from dating in order to recover my finances. And then at the end of the summer, I was like, gee, I don't want to date. I had a good summer. And so I went through another 3 more months. I didn't date again until that winter, actually. And after I started dating again that winter, I became a lot more picky about who I would date, because I realized that any time I could walk away and still go on dates, right? I could still go see my favorite movie, go to my favorite restaurant, go on vacation without the girl, go to a coin show without the girl, right? That was a big wake-up call for me. Because in the past, I didn't realize I could do all that without the girl. I really didn't. I was 22 years old. I was naive. I really didn't realize that because I went out and I never saw guys going out alone or girls going out alone, right? I never paid attention to it. Actually, they do, but I never paid attention to it. Okay, so now a few years later, I'm competing at my first Computer Olympiad. I've been competing at the Computer Olympiad since the summer of 2013. I competed in 6 events that year, and I won 4 medals, if I remember correctly. But most importantly, I realized that I could do a lot of fun things alone, right? Don't need a girl in order to do that, right? 4 years ago, I also broke up with another girl. This was in the springtime, and after I broke up with her, she lived in Bellevue. I was living in Redmond at the time, and on my way home, I got so lost in thought. I got lost on the road, and before I knew it, I was trying to find out where